Pardon me while I have a strange interlude.
There is nothing else. Life is an obscure hobo bumming a ride on the omnibus of art.
Along the misty corridors of time, and in those corridors I see figures, strange figures.
Welcome back, my friends, to the AP Strange Show. I am your host, AP Strange, and we've got a heck of a show for you. And today's show is brought to you by Rent a Poltergeist. Looking to mix things up at your next party and add a little excitement, or perhaps you're just lonely at home and you want a short-term companionship from an otherworldly entity or source of psi energy. Rent a Poltergeist is there for you for all of your short-term paranormal needs. There are longer rental situations if you want them, but if you just want that experience and you just want to get it, have that down on your resume, your rapport with the paranormal world, look them up. Rentapoltergeist.com, and it's a good sponsor to have for today's guest. Because today's guest, I'm very excited to introduce. He is a parapsychologist, the director of the Office of Paranormal Investigations, teacher. He's a mentalist, performing as Professor Paranormal, chocolatier, author of many books, and you've probably seen him on TV or heard him on the radio. An early influence of mine, somebody that I am kind of honored to have on the show. Please welcome Loyd Auerbach. How are you doing, Loyd?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing good. Doing good.
That's great.
I don't know about renting a poltergeist. I definitely would rent a ghost. You know, there is always ghosts are us. So
yeah. Well, you know that's a great point. I mean, of course, poltergeist activity is generally short-lived, but it doesn't seem that way when you're experiencing it.
Right. Yeah.
I do have some firsthand experience with that. Yeah, let's see where to start today.
You wanted to start with mentalism?
Yeah. Yeah, so like I said in the intro, this is one of the things I really appreciate about you, aside from the paranormal investigation broadly and the sense of humor you bring to it. You're performing mentalism as Professor Paranormal. This is something I've been interested in for the last couple of years. Increasingly, is mentalism as it's used in paranormal investigation. So I didn't know if you wanted to like speak to how the insights that you kind of glean from.
Yeah. So I got into magic, magic and mentalism. I mean, I loved magic as a kid. I actually um, went to see the Amazing Kreskin when I was a teenager at Carnegie Hall.
Yeah.
Got to meet him because my uncle had him on a radio show, and loved watching it. This was the era of Doug Henning, so he was
Oh
all
yeah.
over the place. But I also watched people like Tony Slidini on the Dick Cavett show, just some really amazing magicians out there. I just never really did magic at all or had any intention other than those kids' magic things when I was much younger. But in grad school, we had a course taught by a local magician, which covered psychic fraud, but also approached, the principles of mentalism, the basics of magic, things like that. And I was bartending my way through grad school. So magic seemed to be a really good thing for me to do behind the bar to make extra tips. Right. And it was actually not as good as making balloon animals, I have to say that. But
okay.
but it did work really well. And then I joined a local magic group here in the Bay Area before I moved back to New York for a couple of years. And then went back to New York and joined a magic group there. And the magicians I worked with in this club, and it was a chapter of the Society of American Magicians in New York, in the Westchester County area. They were great. I mean, we were hard on each other to hone our performances and our performing personas. And we ended up performing at a couple like a regular show at a couple local restaurants, and then I ended up performing doing comedy magic at a couple of comedy clubs in Westchester. Came back out to California, did some more work in comedy clubs. So I was mainly doing comedy magic, but keeping up on mentalism as much as possible. And then two of my, especially one, I should say, really, it was mainly one of my mentors in parapsychology, Marcello Truzzi, who was a member of the Psychic Entertainers Association, convinced me that if my colleagues in parapsychology are going to take me seriously, I got to really move wholly into mentalism and not be doing comedy magic anymore. So
Oh,
he
okay.
actually tried to convince me to be a very serious, do a serious act. But honestly, I just couldn't do serious. So Professor Paranormal came about,
Well,
inspired by Dr. Science.
yeah, I mean, I've got two things with that, but the mentalism is important, but comedy is important, and
Well,
this is something I hammer on a lot, where I'm always like, you got to have a lighthearted attitude with a lot of this stuff, so it
actually,
doesn't.
doing investigations, I've talked to so many people in the amateur ghost hunting world. We've had more stuff happen in our cases because we have a lighthearted approach. I mean,
Yeah,
think about it. If there's a ghost there or some activity there, don't you want that ghost to like you so that when
right.
you ask them to do something, they do it? So
Yeah,
it's really more about that. And as far as what mentalism's given me and magic's given me doing investigations is, as a parapsychologist, when we do investigations, the first thing we have to do is eliminate all the normal explanations, the non-paranormal explanations. And a lot of that is just simply people coming to wrong conclusions because of their biases in perception. So
right.
I have learned an enormous amount from being a mentalist, especially from performing magic and mentalism. That's given me real insight into being able to pick those things out much more easily. So I'm not even just thinking outside the box. I'm like in the next block and with ideas, kind of looking at different things. And it helps a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, you're hardly the only one. It's like Harry Price was kind of in that tradition as well. Herwood
There,
Carrington, yeah,
yeah, Harry Carrington. Harry Carrington was actually a performer. Harry Price didn't really perform much.
but
Um,
he knew the tricks.
he knew the tricks. And we've had other
Yeah,
people in the field like Arthur Hastings and Ed Cox and others who actually were knowledgeable. Marcello Truzzi, very knowledgeable about things. But one of the things that I did learn was that performing is much more, when you do performing, you really get a feel for how people react to things.
hmm,
And you can see how people are interpreting things in their perceptions. You don't get that from reading books and learning tricks unless you perform them for people. So
yeah,
there's kind of a second level. And I had a conversation with Daryl Bem, who's a social psychologist at Cornell and actually a parapsychologist. And he's a mentalist, performing mentalist as well. And it's really interesting to see, to talk to folks who are either in the sciences and psychology who are also performers. And there really is some extra you get from performing, whether it's card tricks or other things or mentalism,
yeah. I mean, I don't do much performance. I have done tricks for people,
which is
a
good.
little bit,
Yeah.
trying out the close up stuff, and I have to say, like, some of that feels like you're actually doing some kind of magic when you do it, if when you pull it off. Like, I don't think
Mhm.
people realize, like, forcing a card, uh, just the regular old card force, when you pull it off.
Mhm.
If you read that in the book, you're like, that would never work, you know?
There's a
Just I
there's a lot. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of instruction stuff that comes with new tricks is
yeah,
our videos, so
right.
people can actually see how they perform. Because yeah, there's stuff you read. I mean, if you read Corinda's 13 Steps to Mentalism, which is like the Bible of mentalism, there's
Yeah,
stuff in there. It's like I don't see how that's going to work.
yeah.
Yeah, but it does. I mean, it really does when you perform it.
Yeah. So the first time I ever successfully forced a card like that, it was like I almost gave it away because I was like, he took the card I wanted him to take. Like, how did, how did that work?
Right, right.
But it's a great feeling. I don't know if you've ever read Dunninger's book on thought
Oh, yeah,
um,
yeah,
transferring.
I've got, the What's on Your Mind, that one?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I have that one, I have his book, How to Make a Ghost Walk, and I've got some other stuff, and I haven't talked to him in a while, but, a friend of mine was, like, the lead Joe Atmore, he's kinda like the Dunninger expert,
Oh
and
wow,
we've, spent time together. I mean, he was a member of the Psychic Entertainers for a while. He's written a really good book on a couple of really good things on Dunninger, and actually, at one point, we did a recreation of one of Dunninger's radio shows,
oh
and
wow,
he put it out as a DVD. So, um, Dunninger was, incredibly knowledgeable. There was many other folks at the time from the time period that the average person would never have heard of because they never made it to radio or were major performers. But
right?
I have a lot of the old stuff as well as more recent stuff, obviously.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what your take on Dunninger is because he seems like kind of a believer with some of the stuff. Because I was reading like some of the mentalist stuff. I'm like, is he talking about psi? And he's like, there's nothing really. He's saying there's nothing supernatural about this. You're just simply projecting your thought to another person. Like it's just transferring a
Right,
thought. You
right.
know?
Well, there's the explanation for the public and even
Right.
for magicians, and then there's what one might actually believe. Hard to say, because I talked to Joe about whether or not Dunninger believed in ESP, and it seems like he had experiences. I mean, one of the
Mhm.
things that's interesting about mentalism that's different than magic is that if you're on stage as a mentalist and something pops in your head, it's okay to say it, even if it's completely wrong. Nobody in the audience reacts to it because we know that ESP is not 100% anyway. And of course, the person could have gone to the bathroom. So they weren't
Right.
even in the room,
Yeah.
right? If a magician says or does something that doesn't work, people hold that magician to a much higher standard and say, well, that's a sucky magician. That magician's trick failed.
Right.
So we have a distinct advantage. With Dunninger, I know with Kreskin, he he people who knew him, Truzzi knew him, other people who might spoke to him years and years ago. There was some element that he would use whatever would pop up, but of course, most of what he did was stuff that Dunninger did, which was kind
Hmm.
of repackaged. And that's the case with a lot of mentalists. Is that some will go with what they have. They may let it in their own minds. It could just be, and I've talked to some of the guys in the psychic entertainers are definitely disbelievers in ESP, in psi.
Right.
So they have other explanations. It's intuition. It's just something that creativity, whatever it is. Um, they won't ever pin it down to ESP. Others are like, yeah, when stuff pops in my head, it just can't be intuition or creativity. It's legitimate stuff, and they're okay with
Hmm.
it because they feel that when you're portraying that role on stage, you're allowing yourself to do those things. You're giving yourself permission, which works.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I was saying before, the 1-2 punch with comedy, I think, allows you to do that too, because you're opening yourself
Right,
up.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. Sadly, mentalism can be very, very dry, and you at least need to do it with a twinkle in your eye. Otherwise, people get bored pretty easily, pretty quickly.
Right. Yeah. Unless you're well, I mean, there have been some successful ones in recent years doing big things on there was that British guy, I can't remember. He
Darren
did a lot
Brown.
of Darren Brown, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he still has that twinkle in his eye. Yeah, he's
Right.
still
Yeah.
it's like he's got something he knows that, there's a way he's performing that because he was an actor primarily to start with. So he
Oh,
really
okay.
he puts out that kind of energy that I know something you don't. Wink, wink, nod, nod, nudge, nudge kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because it connects with people that way. You really do connect with people. And whether it's comedy or just plain humor, it's the same with the speaker. I was a public speaking coach. I've done a lot of public speaking coaching, and you need a little humor, but that doesn't mean telling jokes.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's just the way you carry yourself.
Right.
Um, Yeah. Because I've never considered myself a comedian, but if I goof while I'm talking, I'll roll with it, you know. So
Yeah.
I used to host like open mics or MC events and things like that, and people always would tell me I was funny afterward. And I'm like, I'm not
Hmm.
really, you know, I'm not going up there loaded with jokes or anything, but I have kind of like a goofy affect when I'm in front of people, and I just roll
And
with it.
stuff occurs to you, and you
Yeah,
if you're in the moment with an audience, stuff will occur
right.
um, in that way. Back to Dunninger, I do want to say, Dunninger is very famous for that, although this is kind of there are variations of it. To those who believe, no explanation is necessary. To those who disbelieve, who do not believe, no explanation is possible. And
Yeah.
that was always his attitude.
Hmm. Um, did Trutzi kind of have a similar attitude to that?
He Truzzi was he was, among other things, a skeptic, but he
Yeah,
was a true skeptic, not the kind of skeptics who seem to wear the S on their chest in that way. What
yeah,
Marcello actually called pseudo skeptics. He was one of the founding members of the Committee for Scientific Investigations of Claims of the Paranormal, CSICOP, in the
right.
70s. He left after about a year when he realized that the majority of the people who started it, or the board, had an agenda to debunk, to say that
Yeah,
all everything was fake. So he actually was a friend to parapsychology in so many different ways. He really did uh, I mean, he actually was a proponent of psychics working with police, and he didn't even necessarily believe they were psychic. He wrote
yeah.
co-authored a book, a great book, if people can find it, called The Blue Sense with Arthur Lyon, who was a mystery writer. And Marcello, having conversations with him, so Marcello's feeling was whether they're psi or not, he thinks that the psychic detectives who work well can look at evidence or a situation and they see something in it that is different. In other words, they see a missing piece, like they're looking at a jigsaw puzzle and they can infer what the missing pieces are. Kind of like that current TV show, High Potential, that's on ABC right now.
Okay.
Um, And to him, he's like, okay, so they're wired differently. If they produce useful information, shouldn't the police use them? That's a
Hmm.
simple question.
Yeah,
Doesn't matter if it's psychic or not. So that
right.
was his attitude. But he was always encouraging of researchers in doing better controls. He was encouraging for me to do investigations appropriately. Um, and he knew a lot of mentalism. He actually grew up in the circus and kind of came from that performing background. Although, and he was very funny, also, I should say.
Okay.
He was very
Yeah,
funny.
because it's funny because Trutzi was kind of a synchronicity around setting up this show because I was reading through your book and a friend of mine, a researcher, had been at the archives in Michigan, where
Hmm.
the yeah, and he had copied a bunch of things, and he just hit me up and said, "Hey, would you be interested in some scans here of the Trutzi files that I got?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, send them over." And then I see your reference to him in your book, and then I picked up a different book and was reading that for another show, and he appears a lot in that other book, so I was like,
He
"Huh." He's making
he
himself
was,
known, I guess.
yeah. I mean, he definitely was, and
Yeah,
I spent a lot of time talking to him on the phone. I mean, before his death, for years actually, I was on the phone with him at least once a week. Mainly because
yeah,
the place where I had my day job had an 800 number, so he called me all the time.
yeah, right. So, he was in Psychop at the same time as the Amazing Randy?
Yeah, he was. Let's just say that he and Randy didn't get along. I won't say any more about that.
Okay, yeah. I don't need to belabor that point,
Yeah,
with what we've
yeah.
already said.
But then again,
Yeah,
I didn't get along with Randy either. So,
yeah, yeah. Um, well, you kind of, picked on something that I did wanna get into, which is that pseudo skeptic kind of idea because,
mhm,
as you say, like skepticism is necessary. You can't just be jumping at shadows and wholesale believing there's a paranormal cause to everything that happens.
right, right.
But on the other hand, if you just exclude half the data, to prove your point that it has a mundane reason behind it, that's not good either. You know,
Or if you don't look at the data at all, which is the case with
right?
many pseudoskeptics, they make pronouncements about parapsychological research in the lab, and they never have looked at the data. In fact, sometimes they'll admit, well, why would I look at that? It's impossible. And that's about as unscientific as you can get.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
you
I
know,
mean, because there is the opposite end of that, which is something that you've brought up before. I've heard you talk about before, which is kind of the reality TV version of everything is demons. Uh,
everything is demons, everything's ghosts, shadow people, all of that. But, the thing about reality TV, which my family's been in television since before I was born, right?
yeah.
My uncle was the director of soap operas. I heard stories from him, from the actors, and actually talked to a couple of the actors in one of the soaps who actually had been approached on the street, and people were thinking they were the characters from the soap
Mhm.
opera. Uh, in reality TV is not reality. It's unscripted, but that doesn't mean it's not directed or people are not told to repeat themselves or to do whatever what the director says. And then they're completely edited to whatever the producers think is going to get a rating, the appropriate
Right.
rating. It's not, and even documentaries have biases. So for people to believe that what they see on TV is is actually what happens in reality as opposed to what's going on behind the scenes, is a shame. It really is a shame, and it's spawned a cottage industry for a lot of people who are doing making devices for ghost hunters that don't do
Mhm.
anything, or
Right.
they misrepresent them, or they're charging hundreds of dollars more than whatever they put together for them. And it's all because people like the gizmos, because the gizmos are better television than the ghost story itself. People tell
Right.
stories.
Yeah. Because I mean, I kind of grew up with unsolved mysteries, and for me, reruns of in search of and sightings.
Mhm.
And so I remember seeing you on sightings when I was younger, and to see like the reality TV version move in it was so disappointing to me when I was younger because I'm like I liked the way sightings did it in the early seasons. That was really interesting.
Yeah, and
But
it
then
was still, I mean, those shows still edited. I was not there for
right,
just 5 minutes. Um,
yeah,
but they did try as much as possible to portray things accurately or without saying, making wrong conclusions or jumping to conclusions for that matter.
yeah, and I mean also when you're on screen, you're not making these grand pronouncements of like, well, ghosts always behave this way, and this is a
There's,
sign that there's a ghost when the needle jumps like this on the device.
yeah, there's no tech that detects ghosts. And
Yeah.
if ghosts are the spirits of deceased people, ghosts are people too. So to say that all ghosts do X is like to say all people do X. And
Mhm.
that's absolutely not the case. We know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I mean, being that people who maybe have only a peripheral interest in this kind of stuff um, are unfortunately exposed to like pretty much ghosts or demons or hoax. Um,
Mhm.
it's really refreshing to revisit your book, the paranormal case book you wrote, because rereading that, I'm like, yeah, this is the stuff, man. This is the more nuanced view of it, where you're talking about how some things are really just PK effects, and you have your apparitional things, which is rare, and you talk about how there could be, survival of consciousness, or could be psychic projection, or it could be a combination of different factors. So
Yeah, and the combination actually is what happens quite a bit. And we don't have all the answers. So we're always looking for more information and more to understand what's actually going on. We don't just, even though I have an idea of what the models are that we work from and the definitions we work from, those could change as science in general learns more about consciousness. That actually
mhm,
could change what we're doing. But parapsychologists have been doing research in and out of the lab on the subject matter, these experiences, Because we have to start with human experiences. We can't start with a spooky building and walking in with equipment without a ghost story. I mean, how do you know there's a ghost there? How do you know there's anything there? Because their equipment tells them there is, but which really is nothing. We have mysteries to solve about human experience, and we change, individual cases can change as we get more information, we get further into cases. But overall, there's more and more that we can learn with more people doing things the right way, as opposed to just simply blindly following what they see on TV.
Right.
I mean, EVPs don't give us any information about what a ghost is, how they work, why they're there. It doesn't do anything. Even if they were genuine, which most of them are not, they're mostly interpretive. They're beside the fact that there's a chance that the human operator is causing those unconsciously from PK
Yeah.
versus a ghost doing it that way. We haven't learned anything from EVPs,
Right. Right.
and we need to do more to figure out what's actually happening. And again, for apparitions, comes back to what is consciousness in some respects.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of how that PK works as well, because the other half of this is photography. I mean, you have the audio with the EVPs, but then there's
Yeah,
photography as well.
right.
And I found it
And
really interesting reading your book that you were saying the ghost isn't actually there. Usually, it's projecting its image into your mind and causing you to see it psychically.
right.
So
Otherwise,
there's
everybody would see it. I mean, if ghosts
right,
were actually visual, not only would we have a lot more pictures of ghosts, but everybody would see it. See the apparition, and that's
right.
definitely not the case.
Yeah. So one of the things you wrote was that there's like a psychical imprint on the film when you do capture something. That's a
So
possibility, right?
right. So if we give an example of Ted Sirios in the 1960s and into the 70s, who was worked with by Jewel Eisenbud,
Hmm.
Sirios ostensibly could put imagery on Polaroid film
Yeah.
with psychokinesis. Others have been able to affect film and we have a lot of data that people can affect electronic devices. And so the idea is that if a ghost doesn't have is not reflecting light or giving off light, which is the only thing a camera can take a picture of, then there has to be some impact on the actual recording medium, the film, the camera itself, maybe the processor for a digital camera. And that intention or that kind of effect would technically, if it's coming from a mind, that's automatically psychokinesis, whether it comes
Hmm.
from a deceased person or a living person for that matter.
Okay, because that's kind of what I was going to ask. Is like in the age of smartphones, do you think it's possible to project psychically into an image with the device? You
Possible,
know?
but we do have cases of people whose phones are really behaving bizarrely because they're under stress. So think of it as a poltergeist case, but it's directed at their smartphone and other devices. I mean,
Huh.
we call those human machine interactions. And we know from laboratory research in that area back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and also work with random number generators and random event generators and other devices since the 60s, that we can unconsciously affect things. In the 80s, I talked to people in Silicon Valley who, because of some things going on with my Apple IIc computer and a particular program that led me to call customer support at
Mhm.
a software company, and they said, "Well, I can't do that." It's like, okay, well, it is doing that. No, it can't do that. This is a simple program. It can't do that.
Hmm.
And I was under a time crunch. I was really stressed out. And then the conversation turned to the guy asking me, "So did this start because you're really stressed? I mean, you sound stressed now, but were you stressed out before you started?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I'm under a time pressure right now." He said, "All right, I want you to turn off the computer, take a step back, go take a walk around the block, let yourself calm down, and then come back. And here's my direct number. You can call me back."
Yeah.
We ended up in this lengthy conversation. And then I ended up talking to other people in hardware and software that the mood of the operator, the stress level of the operator affects devices, computer programs, computers, all of that. And that's straight out of the work that Bob Morris did on human machine interactions. So
Yeah, that's amazing.
yeah, I mean, it's there's a guy I'm talking to who is having problems with his iPhone, and he actually works for a company that works with Apple, and they haven't been able to figure out what the hell's happening with his iPhone, but it seems to be more paranormal activity, really weird stuff that
Hmm.
nobody seems to be able to explain at all.
Wow. Yeah, we're on new frontiers of paranormal investigation with that stuff
Yeah.
because
Yeah, I mean, I can say that one of the weirdest things that happened to me, I was working for a while in the 90s with a man named Martin Caden,
Mhm.
who Marty was the creator. He wrote a book called Cyborg, which became the $6 Million Man. He was a science and science fiction writer. He was a consultant to NASA. He an aviation expert, a well-respected aviation and aerospace expert. He also wrote a book called Marooned, which became an Academy Award-winning film in the 60s. And he was doing PK. I mean, he could do PK. And so
Yeah.
we were doing workshops together after I had done some studies with him in Florida, and we were at one at the University of Nebraska. We were kind of starting out doing some workshop discussion of what he could do leading up to actually teaching people to do some things. We had a group of 102 people, including a lot of faculty members. And I had at that point, it was a Mac PowerBook. So it's like the 90s, right?
Right.
And if you can imagine for a minute, the hard drive in the Mac PowerBook was 40 megs,
Yeah.
tiny.
Yep.
I'm sitting in the back of the room taking notes, and his wife Dee Dee is saying, you really shouldn't be in this room with this computer. And I said, why? Just, she said, just as a reminder, we don't have computers. He works on a typewriter because he hates computers. So I said, I'm not too worried about it. Well, a couple minutes later, my computer crashes
Yeah.
and the hard drive's not working. So I ran upstairs to my room. I had an external hard drive. It turned out it came back on, was able to transfer the information. As soon as I transferred everything to the external hard drive, which was also 40 megs, by the way, um, it crashed and died. And I sent it to Apple, and I get a call back from them that they were going to fix it for free. It was out of warranty. They were going to replace the hard drive because they had
Mhm.
never seen a hard drive burn out like that and not affect the rest of the computer.
Wow.
So don't bring your computers around people who hate them. That's all I can tell you.
Right. That's a pretty intense PK
Yeah.
uh
Yeah. He
affecting
laughed it off. I
electronic.
told him about it. He just said, yeah, you shouldn't have had the thing in the room with me. You know, it was
Yeah. Yeah. Um now, do you find that people that have PK with electronics have the same kind of things moving on their own accord, or is it separate kinds of PK
it
in
can be
your
it can
experience?
be very separate kinds of activity.
Right.
I've had cases, and my colleague John Kruth, who's the executive director of the Rhine Research Center, had a case of kind of an electronic poltergeist situation where things electronics were acting up, nothing else. I had a case in Westchester County years ago where, and we figured out. I mean, it was the woman who was there. She was the poltergeist agent, and we could figured out the trigger and all that. But she not only had electronics acting weird, but her appliances in the kitchen, and it had this was kind of a little bit of a clue to what was going on, would actually turn on without being plugged in, would start working
Yeah.
without being plugged in. And it was all in relation to her reacting to things her husband was saying and doing at the time.
Huh.
So it's not just, I mean, technically, obviously, she had a stand mixer. It wasn't plugged in. It was turning on. That was moving, but not moving the way we think of it for a poltergeist case typically.
Hmm.
So those kinds of things can happen. There can be cases where the majority, poltergeist cases where the majority of things that happen are physical movements or that kind of physical activity. And then the electronics also have a problem. But in those cases, the electronics is not the major piece of it. I haven't seen really cases where it's been the major thing is focused on electronics and then you also have movement. That's only in
Hmm.
my experience.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I've had various PK effects plague me throughout my life. A lot less so in recent years, but Typically, it was always physical things, but occasionally there would be an electronic component, or electronics would act up around me.
Yeah, Robert Morris, who was like one of the main people doing these kind of human and machine interaction bits of research in the 70s and 80s, had a great story that he told. He met a Xerox machine installer back. This is the early 80s, and those copiers break down all the time. Even to this
Mhm.
day, they break down all the time. And this guy had an impeccable record of when he was able to decide where in an office to put the Xerox machine, that machine never broke down. He had this
Hmm.
record with the company. And it turned out that he would go and before deciding where to put it, he'd observe, like from the background, he'd observe office interactions. And he would put it where it had the least chance of having anybody stressed out around it. So if there were issues, interpersonal issues with people in the office, that's not where you put the machine. You put the machine where, people are happy. So sometimes it ended up in where the coffee maker was because, or the water cooler or things like that. But
Yeah,
that in itself is an indication that someone in technology recognized that people affect things without intending to.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And after your story about the computer frying during the Martin Caden talk, I'm wondering if there's like a secret file at Apple somewhere about side effects on hard drives.
That's a really good question that all the tech companies might actually have those secret files for all we know.
Right. Yeah.
Just and they probably won't, they're probably just collection of reports and mysteries that they haven't solved, and they may not
Yeah.
label them as psychic. Um, but definitely there are people who are interested in kind of how we affect devices
Right.
ourselves. There are those people who can't wear a watch, and whatever watch they put on it just doesn't work. And
Yeah.
that may be an electromagnetic effect for some kinds of watches, but not all watches. Not wind up analog watches. And what's really interesting because I've met people who said who came to my lectures or something else, and they said, "Well, I can't wear a watch." I say, how are you feeling about? I mean, are you ever consistently late to places? Do people tell you that you have a problem with time? And every one of them says, yeah, I hate being on time. I hate having to worry about being held to a schedule. Well, that's a good
Huh.
psychological reason to not have a watch.
Right.
Not
Yeah.
that
They
that
just
works.
kind of resent this reminder of time on their wrist all the time. So it just,
Right.
because that's the thing about PK is that it's this generally, well, I mean, I guess with the recurring spontaneous psychokinesis that I think that was William Roll that came up with that
Yeah. Bill
term.
Rowland and J.G. Pratt. Yeah.
Right. Um, it's expressing something that you maybe don't on the surface recognize about yourself.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, it's very often psychological. It's often stress related, but it can be kind of an indicator of something that, a dislike or a frustration, things like that. And we also have a certain percentage of cases that seem to be related to neurological issues too.
oh, that's interesting. Um,
Yeah, one study done by Roll and Jerry Salfin a number of years ago, and then Barry Taff has done some studies on this too, that about 30% of poltergeist agents have either actual epilepsy or they have some kind of epileptiform activity in their temporal lobes. So, in other words, they have something going on in their brains. Um,
right.
Barry has told me stories, and actually Jerry Salfin told me stories also about people who had epilepsy who had the poltergeist activity happening. And during the periods that they had the poltergeist activity, some of them went off their epilepsy meds, because they weren't having seizures.
Huh.
So there's a kind of like a hypothesis that maybe the poltergeist activity is the seizure, is the kind of expression of the seizure. Instead of being inside the brain, it goes outside, or that there's some
Yeah.
connection.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I do recall reading something that Barry Taff wrote about that. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually really um, super interesting. And I mean, stress is kind of similar. I mean, if you're not you don't have there's got to be some kind of brain activity going on with stress that causes that to
Right.
happen.
Right. And
Um,
stress can cause issues in your body. I mean, when we're stressed out in our lives, we can have issues pop up in our health, our
mhm,
physical. So, is that, it's often called, psychosomatic. A psychosomatic illness is one that has an actual physiological something going on, but it's caused by psychological mindset or something psychological happening. And that's as opposed to hypochondria, where you just make it up, right?
right,
Um,
right,
so, what's causing that ulcer for you if you're stressed out? I mean, that's a mind body, mind over matter effect. That's a form of PK. Just
right.
directed in. I'd rather have stuff flying around my house than have something happen to my body, honestly.
Yeah. Well, unless you can control it, because like
Oh, that's a different
you, you
story.
you you do hear about llamas and stuff that are able to adjust their core body temperature or do fantastic things like that. So
Yes. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so some of that might come in handy. Um, but speaking of that, with the usefulness of these PK effects, we had spoken once before, and you mentioned what you called stupid psychic tricks. I don't remember
Yeah.
know if you remember talking about this, but
I don't remember talking to you about that, but I have talked about it with others. Yeah, and I think I'm trying to remember because when you mentioned that in the email, I was trying to remember what Joe McMoneagle, who was the number one viewer of, for the Stargate program, the remote viewer, he had a
right.
stupid psychic trick, and I cannot remember for the life of me what that was, and I wasn't able to get in touch with him to find out. But I'll tell you what, where this actually came up was when I was working years ago at the American Society for Psychical Research. And we had a visiting researcher from Canada, from a university up in Canada, by the name of Bernard Grad, who was doing psychic healing research with a particular healer. And I worked in the education department at one, and we had talked a little bit in the lab. And he came into the education department and to chat with me, and he slaps his keychain on the desk. And at
Hmm.
the end of the keychain, the key fob is this what looks like a black rock, but it's shaped with a point at the bottom. It's kind of tubular and
Hmm.
it's very hard and it's got striations in it and such. And I say, "What's that?" He says, "That is a mummified banana, piece of a banana." I said, "Okay." Then he says, "The healer that I'm working with has one other talent. He can mummify bananas very quickly. No other fruit, just bananas."
Oh, so you can only do it to bananas.
Yeah, that is a stupid psychic trick. Sometimes stupid psychic tricks can be actually useful. Alex Tanis, who was our psychic at the ASPR, had, I would say, not a stupid psychic trick, but kind of a useful psychic trick where I would sometimes have to drive him to different parts of Manhattan. Uh, I wouldn't have to. I volunteered to do that because I liked hanging around Alex and talking to him.
Hmm.
And going back to the ASPR, which was a half a block off of Central Park West on West 73rd Street, it's a one-way street going down, and there were rarely any parking spaces on the street because it was a very, very busy area. And we would head up there, and he said, "Okay, before we get there, let's turn down this street and let's go around a couple times around the block." And at one point, then he'll say, "Okay, now turn on Central Park West, quick, turn quick on West 73rd Street. There's a space right in front. Turn onto West 70th Street, 3rd Street, and someone is pulling out from right in front of the ASPR." He had the ability to find parking spaces in New York City without any problem. About one
Now
of the That's one of the
yeah.
most useful talents I ever could think of at that point in time.
See, that's something somebody would pay for. People would pay for that psychic
Right,
skill.
right. That's right. Yeah, so they're the stupid psychic tricks and they're the sort of dumb but useful psychic tricks as well. Some people have. Bending silverware is not really anything more than a stupid psychic trick.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of cool though. I mean,
Yeah.
you can
Well, I think mummifying bananas is pretty cool too.
it is cool, and it's funny because I ended up coming across a case that Nandor Fodor wrote about for Fate magazine. It was called "The Goblin of the Loaf," and it was this one family in England that just the woman kept baking little cakes, and then they come out in the morning and like half of it would be gone, and sometimes it would disappear before their eyes, like it was almost like it was being eaten from the inside. Somebody
So somebody was doing a stupid psychic trick to her stuff. Yeah.
basically, yeah, the cakes every time she baked.
Yeah, I keep on. I really need to. This is something I need to do, and then before I die, is start collecting these stupid psychic tricks and these other things, and just publish a book of those, because I think that would be more fun. A little
Yeah,
bit too.
yeah. I mean, I would buy it for sure. It's because I mean, I'm sure there's tons of those that people don't necessarily talk about, but you know,
Right, right.
if you put out a call for them, I'm sure you'd get a lot of responses, especially from your
Yeah.
colleagues.
Just thinking about the spoon bending thing, a number of years ago we had one of our Forever Family Foundation events in Durham, North Carolina. We had a conference open to the public, and the foundation supports the work of evidential spirit mediums in the family grieving process, but also supports research into survival of bodily death. And while we were there, because I was connected to the Rhine Center also, we went over to the Rhine with, I think, 4 or 5 of the mediums were volunteering, and did some ESP card tests with them, just some games. Then
Mm,
we did a kind of a mini spoon bending thing with them, and they were bending spoons pretty fast. One of them, Laurelyn Jackson, who's a well-known medium, was bending them like crazy. In fact, she continued to bend them at the hotel. She continued to bend them in the restaurant we went to after we closed the conference. And I heard from her during the week that her husband was getting mad because she was continuing to bend stuff at her house.
now, was she
And
doing that on purpose, or did she just
it
kind
just
of
was
get
coming
stuck in?
through. It was just, she was laughing.
Oh,
So it was so much fun for her to do
okay.
this. And I think she still does it from time to time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing because I mean, I've seen examples of it. I've seen pictures of it where sometimes these things are just bent in really improbable ways. Because I
Yeah.
mean, there is the magician's trick where you
Oh,
run
yeah.
your finger on it and it doesn't look like you're bending it, but
The,
so
I mean, I know the Psychic Entertainers Association has had some of the best metal benders in the world uh,
right.
as part of it. And the thing is that it's really interesting is that there's certain things you can't do without significant preparation on the spoon or whatever, and even some things you can't do because of engineering issues, like bending over the bowl of the spoon, like that,
Mhm.
because of the structure of the spoon. Also, and I've run spoon bending parties myself over the last 10 years, but back in the 80s when Jack Houck, who was an aerospace engineer who came up with this whole idea of doing these kind of metal bending parties, he had a metallurgist do slices of of the spoons that seemed to flop over or have really weird shapes and compare them with others that were physically bent, and found that there was a difference in the structures, that there was melting that happened on the inside, on the structures, the crystalline structures of the metal, on the ones
Mhm.
that seemed to be paranormally bent, and there were fractures or crumpling on the structure when you physically bent something otherwise. So there was actually an internal difference that was actually happening. And
Yeah,
that
that's
itself
crazy.
is pretty interesting as well. I've also, when I've done them, I've made sure I had some spoons that were so cheap that if you bent it, unless you spent a lot of time taking it really, really slowly, they're going to snap. And
Right.
I'll test them first. People are still twisting them to all sorts of shapes.
Hmm.
And at one of the events I had, there was a woman who joined us who was friends with one of my students. She was a stand-up comic, and she had everybody laughing throughout the whole thing, which was great. And
Yep.
as we finish up, she says, "Hey, does anybody ever unbend these things?" And so for the very first time, I had everybody yelling unbend at spoons and things, and she was straightening things out, which if you physically bend a spoon into a spiral, trying to straighten it out is next to impossible, especially without it snapping in some way. And she was still able to.
Right. Wow. Now, when you do this, is it always metal? It's only metal. Like if you use like a plastic,
I
um,
had actually I saw somebody bend actually a couple of plastic spoons.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah, that was kind of crazy. And I didn't have any, but I really wanted to see somebody bend a wooden spoon.
That would be cool.
That would be very, very cool. Yeah. I had somebody once send me photographs. He was doing PK at home, and they sent me photographs of a pencil that looked like it was tied in a knot. Wooden pencil. I didn't know if that was really a wooden pencil, if it was just something, so I really couldn't
Well,
comment on.
they used to sell those rubber pencils at, like,
I
gag
know.
gift
I
stores.
know.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
so
I couldn't
I'm sure you're
tell.
familiar. Yeah.
Yeah. It looked like a real pencil, with the lead and everything, but
Yeah,
if I don't get to see it myself, there's not a lot I can say about it.
right. Yeah, I mean, it would be quite the trick. Um,
Yeah, from a just
but
there are things honestly, there are things that have happened that I've observed that if we could make those as magic tricks or mentalism tricks, there's a lot of money to be made in that world. In one of the the seance shows that I did with my friend Larry Lobig years ago, we had a show called Seance Fiction Theater, and
mhm,
we performed it at a few restaurants, two of which were haunted restaurants. I mean, places where there had been real activity reported.
yeah,
And at this one, the Moss Beach Distillery, which is one you'll find on my sightings of the Moss Beach Distillery, for example.
yeah,
Did one at the distillery, and for window dressing, I had tarot cards and a crystal ball, and I had one of the plasma balls, the lightning balls. I even have a little one up here behind me.
yeah,
Um, all right, so that's on. It's giving off its glow, and the plasma lightning's happening throughout the whole thing. And as we're doing our thing, someone in the audience, and we had a few magicians in the audience actually that at that particular show, they're look at the ball. We turn around and on these things, see if my battery's even on here. No, batteries. Oh, there it is. You probably can't. You can sort of tell it there, right?
right.
And when you
Yeah,
put
and
your
that
finger on it, you get that kind of effect, right?
yeah, well, so this is an audio medium, but, for
Oh,
listeners,
I didn't
y
realize we were just doing audio. So anyway, so
but
basically with these plasma balls, when you put your hand on one of the big ones, you get the lightning hitting the glass around your hand. So you get an outline of your hand.
right,
And that's, people can actually see that when they're using a real hand. So what the guy pointed to when we looked back, there was there were several bits of lightning outlining a hand,
mhm,
and it was moving around the globe,
yeah,
which is not possible with no one
right,
touching.
yeah,
We actually looked into because that, actually, I'll be real honest. We had these magicians come up to us afterwards who didn't believe there were ghosts there at all. Larry was a true skeptic. I have had my encounters at that place, but a couple of them, they would come up and say, "Well, how did you guys do that?" And Larry looked at me, and without batting an eye or missing a beat, he said, "We can't tell you because we haven't decided if we want to sell this yet or put this out to the public."
yeah,
And I realized when we talked about this, is if we were able to create that effect, we had a lot of, we had a good uh, audience to sell to. We had a
right,
consumer base right off the bat. We could not, we talked to people who knew about the construction of these things, who knew about static electricity, electromagnetism. Nobody could figure out how to do that, except for a
yeah,
really extensive mechanical thing that was not possible, really.
yeah. I mean, that sounds like a once in a lifetime thing too. That was the only
Yeah,
time that happened with the plasma ball, was
that
that?
is the only time I've taken the plasma ball to some investigations. Haven't had any kind of that kind of interaction, but I think it was partly because of the setting that we had, and the ghost.
Yeah.
She's a little more playful.
Yeah, the Moss Beach Distillery ghost was the blue lady, I guess, right?
Originally called that, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, she hasn't
and she
worn blue clothing since the 19 or since 91, late 91.
okay. But yeah, she seemed like a really playful kind of spirit.
Very
I thought
playful, yeah.
really funny how she would, I guess she would smack people on the butt with a spatula. It was
Yeah, the people who came in for repairs during the day before the place opened, would
Yeah.
often get smacked in the butt with a spatula if they were bent over, or even a couple of occasions with a frying pan, and there was nobody else around. And so some of the folks were a little bit nervous about coming back a second time. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah, it was kind of like prankster energy, I guess. Was
Yeah, yeah.
So I witnessed that same kind of effect when I worked at a convenience store when I was younger. There was a delivery guy that came in. It was a very busy time, and I saw him going to stock one of the shelves, and he had stopped in his tracks, and he was on his knees trying to stock something, and he stopped and he's looking at it because the beef jerkies were all jumping off the hook one by one. And I
That's
said to him, "Don't worry, that happens here all the time." And he
right.
I never saw that
Well,
delivery guy again. He took a different route after that, I think.
and on the USS Hornet, one of the things that has happened, it still happens once in a while, is women on the USS Hornet Aircraft Carrier Museum get goosed
Yeah.
by the sailor
Yeah.
ghosts. So not a very
Uh,
Me Too location, but
right. It was a different time, many different times, probably.
yes, many different times, and especially guys from the 40s. So you got to give
Yeah.
them leeway.
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess in that case, you had one of the commanding officers seem to come back.
Yeah,
Or,
J.J. Clark,
right.
Chocolate Clark has been there, and one of the few that's been identified because he was identifiable. We've actually had to work through. It's been a while, but we had a couple situations where one of the sailors was bothering the receptionist for the foundation, and working with at that point he would retired as an admiral. So Admiral Clark, we worked
Hmm.
with myself and a psychic worked with Admiral Clark to, let's just say, send down the chain of command that this guy shouldn't go anywhere near her. And
Right.
without letting her know what we did, she called me to actually ask, what did you guys do? He's not coming like within 50 feet of me. So,
Wow. Yeah. So it's a dressing down in the afterlife from the
well,
admiral.
that almost all, as far as we know, all of these guys, all the ghosts, all the apparitions that have been seen, been interacted with on the Hornet are former naval officers, non-commissioned officers, and sailors. That's what they were in life. They either served on the Hornet or and have come back in that role as well, or served on another ship and have come back as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that sense of camaraderie
Yeah,
and loyalty to the ship is kind of like the spirit of the ship itself, as well.
yeah, I'd
Yeah.
say so. And the docents, many of the docents in the past, I don't know where we are today with this, but when I started investigating in 1999, the majority they only opened as a museum in 98. A lot of docents were like in their 80s, and they had
Right.
all they were people who they served aboard a ship. These are ex-Navy, they're Navy veterans, and
Hmm.
they were coming back to volunteer as docents because of their recollection of the time and supporting the ship and all of that. And that seems to be what drew them back after death also.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because that's a strong, compelling force, and that's I mean, I come from a family with a lot of people that served, and it's something that sticks with you for a lifetime. You never really lose that pride, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah. Um, so you had mentioned Martin Caidin before, uh,
Hmm.
and you include in your book what he wrote about a ghost plane. Uh,
Yeah. So I actually was at his place um, when after Deke Slayton died. Deke Slayton was one of the
yeah.
original Mercury 7. He was kind of a command and control. He was in control of some of the command center for at the Cape. Um, Good friend of Marty's, and he passed away uh, in Texas. He had a house in Texas. They also had residence in Orange County, California. And this was like I don't have the date exactly off the top of my head, but I believe it was in June he died. He died early, very early in the morning, and only Deke's wife, Bobby, and their daughter, and the doctor at that time, for several hours knew that he had passed away at
Hmm.
home. So a few weeks later, Bobby Slayton gets this letter that was forwarded to where she was in Texas from the FAA, came from California, that there was a noise complaint because that airport, John Wayne Airport, actually has some serious noise restrictions before 7 a.m., even before, I think it's even before 8 a.m. and after for certain types of aircraft. And the noise complaint was that Slayton's racing plane, he had a racing plane, which was registered with a number NX01, I think it was. But anyway, the racing plane was originally stayed at that airport, and he would go out and fly it.
Mm-hmm.
Right at approximately 7 a.m., that plane starts revving its engine. It had a very, very large engine, very loud engine, which is why the noise complaint came. People saw it on the ground. They didn't see anybody near, or they couldn't see in the cockpit who was there, but it's revving its engine. The prop's going for quite some time. And then eventually it takes off and heads towards the sun, more or less. They lost it
Yeah.
on. Okay. Problem being twofold. The main problem was at the time that people were seeing that plane, which was only a couple hours after Deke died. That physical plane was in an aircraft museum in Sparks, Nevada, without the engine
Yeah.
actually in the plane.
Right.
And that plane was exactly the right colors, his own colors, the right registry, all of that bit of it. The other thing was that nobody could figure out is if it was that kind of plane as a racing plane, somebody needed to kickstart the prop. Now, maybe
Mm-hmm.
nobody was looking, but nobody saw anybody kickstart that prop. It was sitting out there on the run, near the runway, and suddenly the prop started up. So for someone, it would be the ultimate coincidence for somebody to build a replica of Deke's plane, have it out there, but with a different kind of engine that it didn't require the prop to have somebody kickstart it, and to launch it and never be seen again only a couple hours after Deke died.
Yeah.
That would be one of the least likely coincidences ever, especially
Right.
since no one knew where the plane even came from because it wasn't everybody, it was not there. So
Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing story, and it kind of raises questions. I mean, I guess with the apparition stuff, it's not necessarily people think you die and then you end up coming right back looking exactly how you did when you passed.
which
And
is
like,
actually not true anyway for any
right,
almost any apparition. Yeah, you die at 95, you're going to look like you're 30 most likely when you show up to people.
well, right, yeah. And I mean, as you mentioned with the Moss Beach distillery ghost, like she always wore blue, but then she didn't anymore after a while.
Because
Like,
somebody advised her how not to. Yeah.
right, yeah. But yeah, this is all super interesting because then you could have things manifest like a ghost plane or a ghost
Yeah.
car. I
Yeah.
remember reading about a ghost double decker bus in I think in London in the 70s at one point.
Well, and in some respects, the most interesting thing is that the plane was seen on radar for a time. So it had a physical presence of some kind. So it was actually reflecting radar rays, and people could hear it, and apparently people recorded it. So it's kind of one of those things that maybe it was a physical plane, but that's really bizarre. The most bizarre coincidence there could possibly be in that circumstance.
Yeah, or it was just temporarily a physical plane.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that's really wild. Because I don't know, like rereading your book kind of got my wheels turning with a lot of this stuff because one of your really well known cases is the Black Knight of Petaluma, which is kind of the spirit that seemed like it was a composite of different things that the younger person involved part of his imaginal life, I guess.
Yeah. Although the mother was the one who actually was projecting that
Yeah,
because of her concerns about him. Yeah. I mean, uh, it didn't. Number one, it didn't react to anything. It didn't seem to move the figure, and while it was connected to this woman's son, who was a juvenile delinquent, was actually in juvie hall quite a bit of the
Right.
time. There was a teenage girl. His twin sister was there. She was 16, and stuff was moving around. So it seemed like a classic poltergeist with something else going on until we realized how much of it connected to the mother and her stress level about the son being a juvenile delinquent and some issues with him. As a kid, a younger kid, this son actually had toy armor, toy shield and toy sword. We found these under the house. So there
Right.
was some real connection there. And the Black Knight, a knight in black armor, one of the things she remarked to me, because this was 1979, was that had this been before Star Wars came out, she really would have wondered about, because she started seeing this like years before,
Mhm.
but she said it looked like sort of like Darth Vader.
Right.
And Lucas created Darth Vader. I mean, the whole design of Darth Vader is as a Jungian archetype. The Black Knight is a Jungian shadow archetype
Yeah.
in Western consciousness and
Mhm.
psychology. So it made sense that that thing looked like like Darth Vader. Um, she didn't
Yeah.
come
So
say that to us until after we started talking to her, because she didn't want to think us to think that that was where she got it from.
yeah, and I mean, it's interesting as a case study because it's become very common with a lot of people, especially younger investigators or people that just kind of um, do research or write about these topics. The concept of like the tulpa, the
Yeah.
because of John Keel. So
Oh yeah.
things. Well, I mean, he kind of brought it to like the parent, but talking about it in the Mothman prophecies kind of brought it to an audience nowadays, I guess.
Yeah, and the terms that's been tossed around within our field is just simply thought form.
Right.
Uh, tulpa is a very specific. It comes from the Tibetan belief
Yep.
that one individual can put enough mental energy, who's talented that way, to bring, to cause something to come into being that can then
Hmm.
take on a life of its own.
Right.
There are other kinds of thought forms that are out there that are not necessarily visual. I actually had an experience back during the channeling days in the 1980s, when channeling was really popular, and
Hmm.
people were channeling all sorts of entities,
Yeah.
ancient Atlanteans, aliens, dolphins, you name it, they were channeling them. And I was on a show locally with a panel of channels. So there were several channelers, and I was brought in, and John Climo, who had written the book on channeling. If you want to find a great book, it's called Channeling by John Climo. Um, but I was brought in because I'd done the show many times before, and they wanted me to kind of ask the rational questions about some of this stuff. And I was seated between um, a woman who was channeling like a 17th century Irishman,
Hmm.
and on the other side was a woman who said when she went into trance, she called herself Athena. She was channeling Athena. So she was very quiet. She didn't get a lot of, she wasn't like over the top, and she was barely getting any airtime. During the commercial breaks, as we're taping, I asked her, "So are you Athena, the Greek goddess?" And the response was actually very interesting. She said, "Well, there really weren't any Greek gods. I am the thought form created by the belief in the spirit of wisdom that was called Athena."
Wow.
And I thought, okay, I can buy that. that that was almost, I really, it's not what I didn't say that that's really what it was, but um, that was interesting. I mean, that was a really interesting response. That's so different. It was so different than any of these other channeler stuff.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, uh, this Chandler stuff can be. I mean, let's face it can be pretty goofy sometimes. Like,
Yeah, yeah, and actually, the way we looked at it for the most part is it was for many of the channelers when they were producing psychic information, it was likely this was some part of their personality. It was kind of, think of it as a role play. So instead
mhm,
of being responsible for providing this information, their unconscious created a character to deliver the information. so that anything that was problematic would be laid at the feet of the character, not at the channeler's feet. Kind of like
Yeah,
when people do tarot card readings who may genuinely be psychic, they can blame it on the cards. Whatever if they deliver bad news, it's the cards. It's not me, it's the cards.
right.
And that avoids any sort of blowback later on also. And that certainly was the case with the woman who was channeling the 17th century Irish woman, um, because as she worked with John Climo, who was well aware of that whole model, and worked with me, she realized that she really was the psychic, and she didn't need these characters anymore. So the characters went away because
Wow.
she didn't need them. They weren't really necessarily external. They were coming from within herself.
Yeah, that's really interesting because classically, with old seances and the spiritualist world, they always had like a control spirit that would be
Right,
the
which very well, when there really was something going on, that control spirit may very well have been just simply part of their personality. Yeah.
wow. Yeah, that's interesting because you can think of it in a lot of different ways. Like if you're writing fiction, you're writing fictional characters. Those characters are still an extension of you,
Right.
and they're allowing you to find things that uh, because you do some fiction writing as well, right?
Yeah, I'm a
Mysteries.
co-author of a couple of paranormal mystery novels. One's called Near Death, the other's called Afterlife. And we have a third one which will be out hopefully late this fall called Farsight. That'll be out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you a quick story about a famous fiction writer, fiction and mostly fiction writer, but he was a magician too, a guy named Walter Gibson. So
Yep.
Walter B. Gibson was the ghostwriter for Houdini and Thurston and other people in
Hmm.
his youth. He actually worked with Blackstone and a number of others. He also is the man who created the Shadow, the pulp character,
Right.
and
Yep.
kind of developed the radio character as well. He was very interested in psychic things, and there's a lot of some of the Shadow novels have magic in them. Some of them have kind of like border on the psychic stuff as well. So there was a case back in the 60s, which Hans Holzer also investigated. But among other things, there's a house in Greenwich Village.
Hmm.
It's I think 12 Gay Street. And it's still there. And it was originally a bigger house, and it was bisected. And people who were living in one half of the house now reported hearing and seeing people walking up and down non-existent stairs to apartments and having a party, which probably related back to when the house was one full big house, because that's where the stairwell was, even though they didn't see a
Right.
stairwell, right? So that's that repeat residual haunting kind of thing. So upstairs in the upstairs apartment, it was reported that people were seeing, in the semi-darkness, if the room was not completely lit, they would see a figure in evening clothes kind of approaching them. And the way that this person was described, it was basically a description of Lamont Cranston from the Shadow novels.
Right. Right.
And then it would morph into a shadow and disappear. So folks thought there's a figure there. So Holzer, I don't can't recall exactly what Holzer said about that. I mean, he did work out that it was an imprint otherwise. Well, it turns out that Walter Gibson lived there in that apartment. He
Yeah.
lived there for the last couple of years when he was finishing writing the last bunch of Shadow novels. And he made the comment that, and this was in like a 1965 newspaper interview, that when he wrote The Shadow, he brought Lamont Cranston to life and the Shadow to life in his own mind. He let them tell him the story. So
Yeah.
he posited that this was not just an imprint of somebody; it was an imprint of a thought form.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Fictional
that's
character come to life. Yeah.
right. Yeah, that's amazing, and that is something that's come up on this show before. That fiction isn't always just fiction, and these ideas have to come from somewhere, and they have a spirit all their own in a lot of ways. So
Well, that's right. But the greatest superpower we all have is our imagination,
yeah,
our creativity. which is connected to psychic phenomena.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say so. It's and it is kind of funny with the Houdini connection because this is kind of coming full circle. Is that Houdini famously debunked a lot of uh, a lot of spiritualists,
Yeah,
and
he didn't start out doing that. He was after his mother died, he started going to medium after medium to try to connect with his mother because he was a mama's boy, no question.
right,
And he got turned off by all the phonies he saw. So I'm, can't say for sure, but it sure looks like he got so mad because so many people were trying to get his endorsement by pretending to contact his mother that he went after them.
right. And even with that adversarial kind of thing, after a while, a
Yeah.
lot of spiritualists seem to believe that Houdini had superpowers and just didn't
Arthur
want
Conan
to
Doyle
admit it.
certainly, Arthur Conan Doyle, who
Yeah,
had a friendship with him, apparently argued with Houdini, even after Houdini explained how he did some of his illusions, that Houdini was making that up, and really he had supernatural, paranormal powers. Yeah,
yeah, he wasn't the only one either, though. I mean, I found a lot of
yeah.
some kind of I'm a Houdini nut at this point, and I guess Walter Gibson's brother lived in my hometown of Worcester,
Hmm.
Massachusetts. He was a teacher here, and Gibson had delivered the draft of the Houdini on Magic book
Hmm.
to Worcester to his brother to give to Houdini because he would do a when he was in town, he knew a lot of academics and would do presentations at like Holy Cross College
Hmm.
and Clark University and things like that. Um, so that's kind of cool. I got this local connection to him, but
Yeah, yeah, that is cool. I was fortunate to talk to Gibson on the phone at length and then meet him in person because after I found out that he had done investigations in the 50s for the ASPR. You know,
yeah,
that case you mentioned where recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis came out was
yeah,
the Seaford poltergeist case on Long Island. And apparently what Gibson told me was because I found something in the files back then that he was involved in that case, and he told me he was. That he
wow,
had this stuff himself. There was another magician, Ormond McGill, who had told me the same thing too, because I got to know Ormond before he died.
oh man, yeah. Orman McGill. That's one of my white whale books. Is his book on mentalism. I've looked for it. It's out of print, so it's kind of hard to get an
Yeah,
affordable
yeah. There's
copy.
also a
But
book he did on miracles too,
yeah,
creating
I
your
can find that one, but
yeah.
the other one I haven't been able to find an affordable copy yet. But
Mm.
that's on my list. So, all right. So we've been talking for a bit now, and I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but so we start winding down. I do very much appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, though. This has been a lot of fun.
No,
And
it's been
geek
a
out.
different conversation than I normally had on on podcasts. I'll have to say that it's been good. Yeah, been very
Yeah,
good.
that's kind of what I shoot for is to talk about some fun stuff that maybe you don't get the chance to talk about as often, you know. But so for my listeners, uh, I wanted to point out that you do live question and answer things
I
on
do.
Facebook regularly.
Not on
So
Facebook, on YouTube.
on YouTube, rather,
Yeah,
yeah. But
I used to
I
do
always see
Facebook.
the oh,
Yeah,
okay. I always see the links on Facebook still, I guess, to the YouTube
yeah,
one. But
yeah. Yeah, so I do this every other Sunday night session called Ask Professor Paranormal. Um, it 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 will be. I'm not quite sure when you're going to air this, but the next one's March 2nd, then March 16th, then March 30th. Give people through March, and then it'll be every 2 weeks through the end of May, and then I have to readjust because I'll be in an event in June that kind of pushes it back a week, and then it'll be every 2 weeks for the rest of the year. But folks can find the links actually, or when the upcoming shows are on the YouTube channel. Especially if you subscribe, you get notifications. It's just youtube.com/at Ask Professor Paranormal. Just the whole thing spelled out. And then I do have relatively new website, which is just simply LoydAuerbach.com. And that includes some information about the show and upcoming things as well. But a lot of other things. There's actually sections of my paranormal casebook. That FAQ that's at the beginning of a paranormal casebook is actually up online as well. And I'll be adding, I'm just about to write a new blog because I haven't really started blogging much there, but I'll be blogging on that website as well. The key element to find that website is to remember that my name is spelled with one L, not
Yeah, I
two.
was gonna say that for listeners. One L in Lloyd.
Yeah.
Uh, was that your choice to change,
Oh, no,
or
no, no.
you were
It was
you
my
were always?
parents, and I got two different explanations.
Oh, okay.
My mother said it looked better. My father said it was just for the elephant, which is where my sense of humor comes from.
That is a classic dad joke.
Yeah. And he was pretty young when he came up with that too. Um,
Right.
yeah. Yeah. So those are the two places they can find me, but also you can follow me on either X, which I'm still on, Threads. I'm on Blue Sky Social, just simply at Prof Paranormal.
Okay. Excellent. So yeah, definitely listeners go find Lloyd online and follow along and take advantage of the Ask Professor Paranormal because it's
Please do. Yeah.
um I'm sitting here geeking out because I get to ask Professor Paranormal things, but you can too. So
Right.
all right, thank you so much, Lloyd. Thanks for coming on the show. It
You're
was great
very
talking to
welcome.
you.
Very
All right,
welcome.
take care.